This is Katrin with Disability Rights New York. Welcome to our podcast, Empire State of Rights, closed captioned. We are here to bring you information on the most relevant topics regarding disability rights and advocacy. Today, we will be discussing common do's and don'ts of service animal etiquette. Before we get started, we'd like to give a special shout out to our follower, Darlene, for requesting this podcast series on service animals. In this series, we will be discussing the legal role of service animals, legal protections, common myths and misconceptions, etiquette, and differences with emotional support animals. Make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube to follow the full series. We now welcome Christy Asbee, PAAT, PATBI, and PAVA Director here at DRNY. She's going to speak on the subject. Christy, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So we've spoken about the article that came out a couple of weeks ago from the Department of Transportation, or DOT, and the proposed changes to service animals and emotional support animals and their regulations, specifically around transportation. So part of this series is going to be touching on that. There is a comment period that will be closing shortly. So to our audience members out there, if you have comments that you'd like to submit, you can follow the link at the end of this podcast. So let's talk about the do's and don'ts of interacting with a service animal. When you see someone that has a service animals, what are some big don'ts with them?
Right. I think primarily if you see an individual who is using a service animal, whether or not that animal is identified as a service animal with a vest, assume that the dog is working and don't assume that it will respond in the same way as a pet to distractions or need for attention and things like that. So basically, if you see a service animal, you don't need to respond to that visceral reaction to go up and cuddle and coo the dog.
Right. And we're seeing so many different dogs everywhere now, right? They're in the supermarket sometimes. There have been some relaxed regulations with dogs that are pets being in bars. And if you're a dog person or if you're an animal person and you want to go up and say hello or pet or get close to that dog, it's really not a good idea when we're talking about a service animal.
Right. I think because inherent in the job of a service animal is the need to have concentration and make sure that they are providing a service to the handler. The handler is generally the person who has the dog to help manage a disability. In order for the relationship between the handler and the dog to be strong, to ensure that the dog is in fact a service animal and is able to provide tasks for the person, that dog needs to have concentration. It needs to be reliable. It needs to have a very strong connection with the handler in order to perform the tasks that the handler needs so that the handler can then manage the disability.
And so we talked a little bit in the beginning about the differences between service animals and emotional support animals. Would these same don'ts apply to an emotional support animal?
No, because generally an emotional support animal isn't afforded the same legal protection. So you wouldn't see an emotional support animal in a public space type context beyond on airplanes and that the airline context, because the ADA allows service animals to accompany a person with a disability. It doesn't allow emotional support animals when it comes to Title I, II, or III of the ADA.
And these rules about service animals, do they only apply when that animal is on duty? Is there a time when they're not on duty?
The law doesn't really define a working dog as being on duty or off duty. So a service dog, if it meets the definition of a service animal, is a service animal whether or not it's working for the individual at that specific time or not. Generally speaking, if you see a service animal in a public space or in the workplace, it is working. And where it wouldn't be working or if it's off duty would generally be more in a private setting, from my experience at least, because an individual would rely on the dog to perform tasks where, in many different settings. So to assume that a dog is not working simply because it doesn't have a vest on is really problematic, I think, in the broader sense.
Right. So obviously a dog is not clocking in from 9 to 5 or having overtime, that kind of thing. But let's talk about some other don'ts when it comes to service animals.
Right. I think it's really crucial in order for a service animal and their handler to have a really strong relationship. It is for individuals in the public or in the workplace or wherever the service animal is accompanying the individual, that people in the public don't distract a working dog. So a service animal needs to have focus and concentration. That's key to the service animal team. So this can include, distractions can include feeding, staring or taking pictures. These are all things not to do. Don't approach the dog with another animal because, again, that's a distraction for the service animal.
Right. That's a good point. So if you're in the same space and you have your personal pet with you, what do you do?
Well, there's no law that prevents a pet from approaching a service animal. However, in some instances, you may be with your pet and they may approach a dog that is a service animal, but it's not wearing a vest. So it was not possible to identify initially, and the interaction has already happened. I think generally speaking, it's best to read the social situation and to read your environment. Dogs are inherently social creatures. Other pets might want to go up and have an interaction, but in order for a service animal to stay focused and on point and able to respond to their handler's needs, it's really best if they don't have the distractions of other pets around. So if you can avoid interacting unnecessarily with a service animal, then that's always a best practice. Now, everybody is different, so people may have different relationships with their service animals, and it may not be as big of a problem for some as it is for others. So I think assuming that you want to avoid any contact to avoid further distractions, that's always, in my opinion, I think that that's a best practice.
Right. And as pet owners, you know how your pet responds to certain situations as well. Now, if there's a distraction, whether it's through your pet or from someone coming up and deciding they want to pet a service animal or do something that is distracting, is that dangerous to the team, to the service animal team?
It can cause some potential problems, or it could just amount to an annoyance. It kind of just depends on the team itself, and it depends on the individual with the disability and what kind of disability that individual has and what the service animal is tasked with doing. For example, some individuals use small service animals to respond when an individual's having a seizure or about to have a seizure. These service animals rely heavily on their sense of smell in order to respond. So they also happen to be very small and very cute. So any level of distraction could have a really negative impact on somebody where they're relying on their dog or their service animal to be immediately responsive upon smell. That's why it's really important when you see a dog with an individual to avoid distractions if you are not sure that whether or not it's a pet or if it's a service animal.
So this conversation just reminded me of an article I read probably a month ago, and it was about if you see a service animal without a handler, it's possible that the handler is in trouble. So in cases like that, do you have a suggestion if you're in public and you see a service animal kind of out on its own without a handler, what should someone do?
That's a really tough question to have an exact answer to. Reading the social situation, perhaps considering what kind of dog it is might indicate how to respond. If the animal is a guide dog and it says so on its vest, that might be you might need a different response than if the animal indicates that it's a seizure alert dog. However, I think probably in the majority of cases, if you do see a situation like that, it's best to, maybe call the police or call 911 to try to get some guidance there if you're not able to identify what the issue is with the handler.
Agreed. Every situation is going to be different. So I know we talked about this the last time we spoke, but I think it's important and worth mentioning again. Let's talk about public entities or private businesses and how are they to interact with a service animal team? Are they allowed to ask about a handler's disability or ask for certification proof?
So as we talked about in previous podcasts, there is no legally recognized certification process for a service animal. There is a legal definition. So if the animal is a dog or in some instances a miniature horse, and it is individually trained to perform a task or tasks for an individual with a disability, and the animal is not a distraction or a nuisance and is housebroken, then the animal can be legally identified as a service animal. By law, the two questions that a government program or a business open to the public can ask is this animal a service animal? And what tasks does it perform? Those are the only two questions. Generally speaking, it's a best practice for businesses and government programs to, if they ask these two questions, to note the animal's behavior. If the dog, or in some instances, miniature horse, is behaving in the space and is not causing any problems, and it appears to be housebroken, then it's best to assume that the animal is a service animal and it's working on behalf of the person with disability.
Really great information. Now, just to wrap this up, what advice do you have for people who are unsure of how to interact with an individual, their service animal, and how they work as a team?
I think understanding the role a service animal can play for an individual with a disability is key to responding appropriately in social situations. A service animal is not a pet. It is a working dog. So the service animal may be really cute and appear really cuddly, and you want to coo it and you want to go up and give it attention. And that is a perfectly rational response to a dog. But when a dog is a service animal, that is not a beneficial response to act on. So you may have that visceral reaction, but don't respond to that visceral reaction. Stop yourself and say, this is a service animal and it's working for an individual who has a disability, and I don't want to interfere with that service animal team, and I don't want to distract that service animal from assisting that person with a disability, in the same way that you wouldn't go up to an individual who is using an aid service and you wouldn't go up to that aid worker and start distracting that aid worker from the work that they're doing for the individual with the disability. It's the same concept. It's the same concept of interfering with an individual's access to assistive technology. It's just not the appropriate response in that social setting. And keeping those practices in mind is, I think, the key for an individual who uses a service animal, who relies on a service animal to go out in public, to keeping their relationship and their ability to manage their disability strong.
And so you just mentioned if, you want to go up and coo and pet and, say hello to a dog, people who are afraid of dogs. What is their response or what's the responsibility there when approaching a service animal?
The law is clear on this issue, both from the regulatory interpretation standpoint as well as case law. The individual with a disability who uses a service dog or service animal has a right to their service animal, regardless of whether or not other individuals in the social setting have fears of the animal. So it has been determined by the Department of Justice, which is the agency that enforces the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as subsequent case law, that fear of a dog does not constitute as a fundamental alteration in any way. So there may be strategies that the business can take, or the individual with the fear of the dog, that they can take in order to respond appropriately so as to not impede on the service animal team's relationship, to make sure that everybody is accommodated. But this is a case-by-case situation. There's factual issues to be hashed out, and there's also a bit of logistics that need to be ironed out in these situations where the individual with the fear of dogs and the service animal team are not just two ships passing in the night, when they might actually have some interaction if they don't line it up appropriately.
Well, Christy, this is such a large topic, and I love our conversations about it. Thank you so much for coming in today. It's been great speaking with you.
Thanks for having me.
Empire State of Rights Closed Captioned has been brought to you by Disability Rights New York, your source for disability rights and advocacy. If you enjoyed our program, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this post. If there is a subject you would like us to discuss, please email podcast@drny.org or comment below. Tune in next Wednesday, where we'll bring you more information on disability rights in the state of New York. The closed caption version of this podcast is available on our YouTube channel. To listen to more Empire State of Rights closed captioned, follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.